Hey, there's no such thing as the deep state, and there's certainly not sex tapes of presidents that were being used against them by people in power. I'm KP Burke, and history isn't boring. Your teacher was. In terms of a life of public service, J. Edgar Hoover served almost 50 years as the head of the FBI. Hoover was appointed by Calvin Coolidge and would go on to serve under 8 more presidents. There were times throughout his tenure that people wondered, who's really running the country? The president or J. Edgar? After the 1936 Olympics, Hoover had his men start a surveillance protocol on a suspected Nazi spy, a sexy Danish reporter named Inga Arvad. While they never found any evidence of her supporting Hitler or even working as a spy, they did find something that would come in handy years later. Inga had been romantically linked to a handsome American naval officer, and Hoover kept audio tapes of one of their steamy hotel room encounters. Even though it gave him no evidence, it proved uniquely useful when President Eisenhower left office and his replacement was a brash, young, idealistic new president named JFK. JFK immediately began clashing with the heads of various intelligence community until Hoover met with the new president and let him know that he had a sex tape of him from Inga Arvad during a pre-World War II investigation. Kind of funny that Hoover seemed to get whatever he wanted during the Kennedy years after that. All it seemed to take was a sex tape. But guys, don't worry about that. Those are just conspiracy theories. For more weird stories from American history, check out American Loser. Link in the bio. Well, they blew up the Chicken Man in Philly last night, and they blew up his house, too. That's Bruce Springsteen singing about an event during the brutal Philly mob war of the 1980s. I'm KP Burke, and history isn't boring. Your teacher was. Since 1959, Angelo Bruno had peacefully ran the Philly Mafia and was known as the Gentle Don. One of the only guys who got in trouble with Bruno was Nicodemo Scarfo, a.k.a. Little Nicky, who he banished to Atlantic City. In 1980, the Gentle Don was executed with a shotgun blast to the back of his head, ending his peaceful reign and starting a war that would kill at least 20 mobsters in the next 4 years. Philip the Chicken Man Testa was now in charge, but as Springsteen told us, his rivals used nail bombs to blow up him and his house too. This made Little Nicky Scarfo the new boss, alongside his godson, the son of the Chicken Man, Salvatore Testa. Testa inherited his father's house, loan sharking business, and a dive bar without a liquor license in Atlantic City called Le Bistro. He was able to make a nice profit, though, by selling the property to a real estate developer from Queens named Donald Trump, who turned the building into Trump Plaza and got away with paying about only a third of what the property would have been worth. Testa would be murdered in Jersey a few years later in 1984 due to jealousy from Little Nicky, his own godfather. And you thought Chase Utley played dirty. Little Nicky would eventually die in prison in 2017. As for Philly, it's still wild, but for more weird history, check out American Loser Podcast. If you thought the homeless were running San Francisco now, did you know one of them was once Emperor of America? Hi, I'm KP Burke, and history isn't boring. Your teacher was. Meet Norton, America's emperor. Norton was a Jewish fella from England who arrived in San Francisco as a businessman. He did well for himself until 1852 when he made a bold move to try and corner the market on rice during trade bans, which blew up in his face. It broke him financially and mentally, so he did the only thing a straight white male can do: write a manifesto. At the end of it, he declared himself Emperor of the United States. As a joke, a San Francisco newspaper ran the manifesto, and there you have it. America has a self-proclaimed emperor, his name is Norton, and he lives in a boarding house. Less than a month into his reign, he actually put out a proclamation where he abolished Congress on behalf of the American people. After that, he abolished the two-party system and ordered General Winfield Scott to use suitable force to clear the halls of Congress. Norton wore a blue uniform of a Union general with gold epaulets and a rusty battle saber. He ate at free lunch counters with stray dogs and never paid to take the ferry as part of his executive privilege. Soon he began printing his own currency with his face on it, and on the 1870 census, Norton listed his occupation as emperor. The emperor also wrote letters to Queen Victoria of England, explaining to her why a marriage to him would help strengthen the relationship between England and America. I mean, look how well it worked out for Meghan Markle. There you have it, Norton, Emperor of America. For more weird history, check out American Loser Podcast. Alcatraz, The Rock, nobody escapes. Or did this guy? I'm KP Burke, and history isn't boring. Your teacher was. By housing names like Machine Gun Kelly, not that one, and Al Capone, Alcatraz had a reputation as being impossible to escape from, with the rough water surrounding the prison island out in San Francisco Bay. There is one case in 1962 that even the FBI hasn't solved, and that's the story of Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers. Frank Morris, a lifelong criminal with a dangerously high IQ, had already escaped several prisons before, but Alcatraz was inescapable. Or so they thought. Working quietly together with the Anglin brothers for 6 months by digging with old saw blades, making a MacGyver-like drill out of a vacuum cleaner, covering up the noise with an accordion, not a joke, and using homemade life preservers. The best part of it all? Arts and crafts, baby. Morris and the boys made papier-mâché heads with hair and all to make it look like they were sleeping while the guards did count every night. On June 11, 1962, Frank and the boys escaped from Alcatraz. The next morning, the FBI launched a massive manhunt and believed the three men had drowned in the bay, but no bodies ever washed up on shore. The case was never solved, but sightings of the three men went on for years afterwards, with the best story being that the Anglin brothers' mother received anonymous flowers on Mother's Day for the rest of her life, and that spotted at her funeral were two very tall and unusual women with heavy makeup and large coats on. Did Frank and the boys make it? Let me know what you think in the comments. And for more weird history, check out American Loser Podcast. Hitler Youth are one of the most unsettling parts of the Nazi legacy. It must have been terrifying to see young boys and girls supporting Hitler in Germany. And Long Island? I'm KP Burke, and history isn't boring. Your teacher was. The 1930s were a crazy time. Nobody knew what to make of that dictator with the funny mustache over in Germany. If only we had seen just how far-reaching his plans were. The Nazi Party wanted the United States and its large German population to have a positive view of Hitler. So what better way to get into the hearts of the American youth than with summer vacations? Welcome to Camp Siegfried in Yaphank, Long Island, a summer camp ran by the German-American Bund, aka a Nazi-funded camp for kids, with archery, hiking, canoeing, other kids, being told you're part of the master race. Sounds like fun. Summer camp, pool parties, lots of pictures of Adolf Hitler. Like lots of them. But hey, there's Oktoberfest and good beer and Nazi flags and lots of Taylor Swift-looking chicks trying to breed more Aryan children. In a very eerie testimony during investigations into the camp, one camper was asked how he was taught to salute the American flag. He responded with a perfect Nazi salute. And when asked, "Is this the American salute?" the camper morbidly said, "It will be." By the time the U.S. was at war with Hitler's Nazi Germany, the camp was shut down by the U.S. government. Prior to that, all activities had been protected by the First Amendment. For more weird history, check out American Loser Podcast. Hey, I'm KP Burke, and history isn't boring. Your teacher was. This is Stanford White. During his life, he was a beloved New York architect who designed several buildings, including the iconic Washington Square Arch, but enough about scenes from Ghostbusters. At Madison Square Theater in 1906, Stanford White was approached by a man who took out a gun and said, "You've ruined my wife," and pulled the trigger. Total tragedy, until it was revealed that Stanford White was, secretly, one of the worst people in human history. It seems once he got invited into high society life, Stanford White's demons started to come out. His apartment on 24th Avenue in Manhattan was revealed to have one room that was painted entirely green with a red velvet swing hanging in the middle of it, which is where he would creepily groom underage girls for his own sordid affairs. Crazy behavior for a guy commissioned directly by the Vanderbilts. White used his power and prestige to carry out affairs with young girls, the most famous of which was Evelyn Nesbit, a beautiful model and actress who had been one of White's victims when she was just 16 and White was 48. Years later, Nesbit would marry railroad millionaire Harry Kendall Thaw, who couldn't believe the horrible story his wife told him about her former friend. His gunshot rang out and Stanford White died inside of a theater he helped design. The ensuing court case was dubbed the trial of the century, with Thaw getting off on account of insanity. According to Mark Twain, who knew and hated Stanford, everyone knew about it and nothing was ever done. Many of Stanford White's buildings are still standing to this day. For more weird history, check out American Loser Podcast. War hero nicknamed Demolition Dick created SEAL Team 6 and then later got thrown in prison? I'm KP Burke, and history isn't boring. Your teacher was. Richard Marcinko tried to join the Marines, but they rejected him for not having a high school diploma. Instead, he joined the Navy and began one of the wildest careers in military history. Starting as an enlisted radio man, Marcinko would become an officer and join SEAL Team 2, seeing intense combat in Vietnam. After the Iran hostage crisis, it was decided that the Navy needed a full-time counter-terrorist unit, and they named Demo Dick as the unit's first commander. Demo Dick would handpick most of his own men to ensure he had the right amount of chaotic cowboys for his new mission. He also named them SEAL Team 6, even though there were only 2 SEAL teams at the time. He wanted the Soviet Union to think we had 6 more teams of ass-kicking cowboys from hell ready to respond on a moment's notice. After leaving SEAL Team 6, he began his infamous work with Red Cell. Tasked directly by a vice admiral to test the Navy's vulnerability to terrorism, Demo Dick showcased some major concerns for base security when he and his hand-picked team of former SEALs were able to infiltrate bases, plant bombs near Air Force One, take over a submarine, and also kidnap high-ranking officers. They eventually humiliated enough people that Demo Dick had a target on his head, and although he claimed it was a witch hunt, he was sentenced to 21 months in prison on a kickback trial. When asked about his time in prison, Demo Dick called it his easiest deployment. That's the man known as Demo Dick, and for more weird history, check out American Loser Podcast. The name Edgar Allan Poe conjures up images of horror, mystery, and hot goth girls. His legacy is that of a celebrated author, but a tortured soul. Alcoholism, opium use, and mental illness are all part of his legacy. But what if our idea of Poe as a moody alcoholic head case is largely taken from his obituary that was written by a guy who straight up hated him? I'm KP Burke, and history isn't boring. Your teacher was. Poe is one of America's literary icons. He was a soldier, widower, writer, poet, editor, and one of America's first ever literary critics. His tales of murder and the macabre made him a celebrated name, but his life was plagued by tragedy, which explains the dark themes found in all of his work. Poe was also a proud Bostonian. Even though Baltimore claims his legacy and named their football team after his most popular work, the Raven, Poe always referred to himself as a Bostonian. Baltimore claims Poe's legacy, but it also claimed his life. Much like Omar from The Wire, Poe found himself dropped on the streets of Charm City. The author was found on October 3, 1849, looking disheveled and in need of immediate assistance. He would die a few days later. Many details of his death remain a mystery to this day. But one thing's for sure. Ray Lewis didn't see shit. Poe's obituary, which was published nationwide and written by a man named Ludwig, cast Poe as a lunatic, drug-addicted drunk that nobody was going to miss. Ludwig was later found out to be Rufus Wilmot Griswold, one of Poe's biggest rivals and worst enemies. Imagine having your obituary written by somebody that couldn't stand you. For more weird history, check out American Loser Podcast. New Yorkers always seem to complain about their mayor, but nobody takes the cake quite like the corrupt reign of Fernando Wood. I'm KP Burke, and history isn't boring. Your teacher was. New York City is built on corruption, and no political machine was better than the infamous Tammany Hall. They ran the city like Tony Soprano ran Jersey. Power is running for office. Real power is running someone for office. Enter Fernando Wood, the man told by the powers that be that he was going to be the first Tammany Hall mayor of New York City. At times, he was considered the model mayor, helping to modernize the city, spending money on infrastructure, and moving along the plans for Central Park. But that was his first term. His second term, he barely won re-election, and that's only because he personally ordered the cops off duty and let his gang, the Dead Rabbits, yes, those Dead Rabbits, intimidate voters and steal ballot boxes. The wildest part of his time as mayor was in 1857, when he started the New York City police riot. In an effort to crack down on corruption, New York State took away Wood's control of the city's police. They created the Metropolitan Police and ordered Wood to disband his municipal police. Wood was ordered arrested, and a full-on brawl between the two police departments would take place in front of City Hall for almost an hour. Just like in Batman, Wood was eventually arrested and sent to prison for his crimes. Just kidding. He was out that night, ran for mayor again, and won. So maybe it's time to cut some other mayors some slack. For more weird history, check out American Loser Podcast. Margaritas all around, muchachos. It's time to celebrate Cinco de Mayo, which is, of course, Mexican Independence Day, right? Wrong. Selma Hayek's birthday? Well, that is worth celebrating, but not on May 5th. Cinco de Mayo is the yearly celebration of the Mexican victory over the Second French Empire at the Battle of Puebla in 1862. Why was that so important? I'm KP Burke, and history isn't boring. Your teacher was. After the Mexican-American War, territory south of the new U.S. borders was sort of up for grabs. A civil war in Mexico nearly bankrupted the entire nation, and the Mexican president, Benito Juarez, told England, Spain, and France he wasn't paying back on the loans he took out. France, under the rule of Napoleon III, sent troops over to invade Mexico. The Battle of Puebla would take place on, you guessed it, May 5th, 1862, when the Mexican troops, outnumbered 2-1, managed to defeat the much better equipped French army. The Mexican resistance proved stronger than expected, and some historians credit this Mexican victory with helping to prevent France from aiding the Confederacy during America's Civil War. The victory was short-lived, however, and a year later the French had taken over Mexico City and installed an Austrian monarch named Maximilian as emperor, until it all went down in flames and Maximilian was executed via firing squad. Mexican President Juarez declared May 5th, the date of the victory at Puebla, as a national holiday, saying, "I don't always defeat the French army, but when I do, I drink Dos Equis." For more weird history, Teddy Roosevelt could do a lot of things. He could take San Juan Hill and give a speech with a bullet lodged in his chest. But even the mighty TR struggled with man's greatest foe, his own teenage daughter. If you thought Hunter Biden and the Bush twins were wild, wait till you hear about Alice Roosevelt. I'm KP Burke, and history isn't boring. Your teacher was. Alice was the oldest child of Teddy Roosevelt. Her mother died 2 days after her birth, and she was raised in Manhattan by her aunt. By the time Teddy became president in 1901, Alice was now 17 and a pop culture icon. The outspoken beauty and fashionista enjoyed the nightlife, smoked cigarettes in public, drove in cars with boys, and kept a pet snake in the White House. At times, her life was wilder than a Britney Spears TikTok. Alice constantly burst into Teddy's office to give her opinion. When someone asked TR if there was anything he could do to limit her interruptions, he said, "I can either run the country or I can attend to Alice, but I cannot possibly do both." When it was time for her family to leave the White House, Alice burned a voodoo doll of the new First Lady, leading to her being banned from the White House by the next 2 administrations. Naturally, Alice's wedding was a wild affair, seeing the bride show up in a blue dress and cut her own wedding cake with a sword. Alice never allowed a dull moment, as even in her older years she was nearly banned from the White House a 3rd time after making too many jokes about the Kennedys. She would die at age 96 and is immortalized by her quote, "If you can't say anything nice about someone, come sit here next to me." For more weird history, check out American Loser Podcast. If you ever felt like one person can't make a difference in America, let me tell you about Leon Czolgosz, a Polish fella from Detroit Rock City who changed the face of America forever with one pull of a trigger, but not in the way he hoped. I'm KP Burke, and history isn't boring. Your teacher was. Leon Czolgosz was born in Detroit in 1873, and after the Panic of 1893 closed the mill he was employed by, Leon began to have major concerns over economic injustice. He found himself hanging out with socialists, anarchists, and other types you can find in a hipster coffee shop. The socially awkward Leon became radicalized and decided to take matters into his own hands. So he picked his target, the President of the United States, William McKinley. While McKinley was greeting the public, Leon shot him twice in the abdomen. Around this time, an African-American fellow named James Parker went full equalizer on Leon, knocking the gun out of his hand, then hitting him so hard he spun like a cartoon, broke his nose, and knocked out several of the assassin's teeth. The UFC-style KO was so brutal that even the wounded president said out loud, "Go easy on him, boys." McKinley would die 8 days later, and Leon would plead guilty and be sentenced to death by the electric chair. If Leon's goal was anarchy, he accomplished that because by killing President McKinley, we swore in his vice president. And that's how America wound up with President Teddy motherfucking Roosevelt. For more weird history, check out American Loser Podcast. We've all heard of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, but what about sex, drugs, and rocket science? Meet Jack Parsons, the man who helped launch the U.S. space program, operated a sex cult, and accidentally started a religion. I'm KP Burke, and history isn't boring. Your teacher was. Jack Parsons liked reading about strange things and blowing stuff up. He was fascinated by the occult and, as a teenager, summoned the devil, which may or may not have worked. Parsons would become a brilliant chemist and rocket scientist, but in 1939, Jack and his wife were taken to the Church of Thelema in Hollywood, and Jack's obsession with the occult deepened. He caught the eye of Aleister Crowley and began to combine the occult's sex magic with his understanding of quantum physics and, more importantly, jet propulsion. Parsons was addicted to several drugs and regularly took part in black magic, but his rocketry work was good enough that the government turned a blind eye to his screwball behavior. Parsons would then meet L. Ron Hubbard. Yes, that one. Parsons was smart enough to help create the modern space shuttle, but for some reason, he was not smart enough to not let L. Ron Hubbard run off with his wife down to Florida with Jack's life savings. L. Ron and Parsons' wife Sarah would go on to create Dianetics and found the Church of Scientology. After being bankrupted and blacklisted, Parsons would die in 1952 from a mysterious explosion in his home laboratory. We eventually did put a man on the moon, but it took a black magic practicing sex addict on drugs to help us pull it off. For more weird history, check out American Loser Podcast. What's the difference between propaganda and public relations? Well, let's ask Edward Bernays. I'm KP Burke, and history isn't boring. Your teacher was. To put it simply, Edward Bernays was the original influencer. He was related to Sigmund Freud and applied his cousin's research thoroughly while working for the U.S. government during World War I in what he called psychological warfare. After the war, he was hired by Beechnut Packing Company to help them, quote, sell more bacon. Bernays was able to develop the idea that breakfast was the most important meal of the day, and it was un-American to have it without bacon. Bernays was also hired by Lucky Strike to help get women to start smoking more. Bernays created propaganda showing only thin and attractive women smoking and appealed to feminists by calling cigarettes torches of freedom. Take that, patriarchy. Now the ladies can give themselves cancer too. Eventually, Bernays began working for the UFC. Not that one. The United Fruit Company wanted to sell more bananas in the U.S., and it worked until Guatemala's president's reforms began affecting sales. Bernays then started up a propaganda effort showing Guatemala in grave danger from communism, which led to the CIA overthrowing their government in 1954. Banana Republic. Get it? Bernays would die in 1995. By then, the UFC was now Chiquita, feminists were smoking Virginia Slims, and propaganda was now known as public relations. Bernays was survived by his loving family, including his grandnephew, Mark Randolph, the co-founder of Netflix. For more weird history, check out American Loser Podcast. Hey, I'm KP Burke, and history isn't boring. Your teacher was. Is it possible that an old Native American holy man put a fatal curse on the office of the presidency? In 1840, William Henry Harrison was elected President of the United States. His nickname was Old Tippecanoe, after a battle he had fought against a legendary group of Native Americans under Tecumseh. Tecumseh's brother was a holy man, and the story goes that he cursed the future president. Nothing really came of it until 1840, when Harrison was sworn in as president. He would die in office just a few months later of pneumonia. This started what became known as the curse of Tippecanoe. When a president is elected in a year that ends in a zero, strange and terrible things seem to happen to that man. For example, elected in 1840, William Henry Harrison dies in office. Elected in 1860, Abraham Lincoln assassinated in office. Elected in 1880, James A. Garfield assassinated in office. Elected in 1900, William McKinley assassinated in office. 1920, Warren G. Harding dies in office, foul play still suspected. From an election in 1940, FDR dies in office. 1960, John F. Kennedy is assassinated by the CIA. Elected in 1980, Ronald Reagan barely survives an assassination attempt. And in 2000, George W. Bush also luckily survives after a live grenade thrown at him does not detonate. Which leads us to the year 2020. Joe Biden was elected, and I want to know what you guys think about that in the comments section. For more weird stuff on American history, check out American Loser, link in the bio. Hey, I'm KP Burke, and history isn't boring. Your teacher was. This painting of George Washington is iconic, but it was almost burned and lost forever, until it was saved at the last minute by a sexy party girl and first lady named Dolly Madison. Long before England and America had our special relationship, there was plenty of hostility left over from that whole revolution thing. This leads us to the largely skipped over War of 1812. It went pretty bad for us early on. So bad that in 1814, well, the British took over D.C., They burned federal buildings, torched the presidential mansion, also known as the White House, shit in Nancy Pelosi's desk, and burned the Capitol building. Try that one on QAnon. President James Madison decided it was time for him and his Danny DeVito-looking ass to evacuate D.C. This included his sexy wife, Dolly, who, by the way, was the coolest first lady of all time. She was also a big, big fan of G-dubs, and with just minutes to spare before the British could capture the celebrity first lady, Dolly sent her trusted servant, Paul Jennings, a black dude, to save the famous portrait of General Washington. The British surely would have burned it, but thanks to Dolly, it was saved. And then something happened. The Americans ate their vitamins, said their prayers, and went full Hulkamania. So thanks to Dolly's heroics, the Americans started kicking some ass again. We wrote the Star-Spangled Banner and won a bloody battle down in New Orleans that technically happened after the war was over, but it still counts, damn it. If you guys want to know more weird stories from American history, please check out the show, American Loser. Link in the bio.